On today's episode of Locked On Suns, one day until tip-off of Game 1 of Suns Timberwolves in the first round of the NBA playoffs. How will the Suns win this series? We'll break down everything that needs to go right. Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 7 seasons, a writer at Suns.com, and the host of the Just Basketball Show wherever you get your podcasts. Also, I create written and video content at the Locked On Suns Insiders, which you can sign up for at the link in the show description below. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen here on this Friday. Final weekday until tip-off. We don't even have to wait that long Saturday, so we are in the home stretch. Thank you for finding us wherever you listen to podcasts. We're free and available everywhere, including YouTube. Hit that button, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you're on. Get a new episode in your feed every single Monday through Friday, but honestly, tons of bonus content coming your way all throughout the postseason. Become an everyday or get locked onto the Phoenix Suns all playoffs long. All right, joining us as he does every single week is Stephen PridGeon. He is a writer over at Bright Side of the Sun, does great content at CHGO in the Midwest, and we're going to break down what has to go right for the Suns to win this game, win this series. Today's show brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 straight to your account, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right, Stephen. So I'm going to throw a big one out to kick us off here, and we're going to ping back and forth for the rest of the show on all the things that need to go the Suns' way in order for them to emerge victorious in this 3-6 matchup. And the first one I have for you is Kevin Durant. He averaged, not huge, in the 3 regular season matchups, but 23, 5, and 4, but massive efficiency, 70% true shooting. But honestly, beyond that, I just think he needs to be consistently aggressive and impactful on both ends of the court for the Suns to win this series. He's going to be matched up with Towns a lot. I expect Towns to guard him, and for Durant to be involved in exploiting that, I would expect Durant to be guarding Towns a lot. Secondary rim protection with the way that the Suns have used Nurkic in this matchup. Rebounding, I think, too, against a very good rebounding team he's going to need to chip in. I think KD, it sounds obvious, but I think he's going to need to be huge for this team to get the W in the series. What do you think?
Yeah, I think looking at KD is important. And I think he dictates for the Suns naturally because of who he is, but also looking at the matchups. Obviously, the Minnesota Timberwolves had the best defense in the league this season. You look even more exclusively to the half court, and you see that they were one of the best defenses in the NBA over the past 7 or 8 years, looking at the defensive rating. And I think maybe the first thing that comes to mind with KD in this specific series is looking at who could potentially be guarding him. So naturally, you might think Karl-Anthony Towns, but I think the last game, if my memory serves me correct, it was Anthony Edwards that started the game guarding him. And obviously, they sprinkled between Edwards and Jaden McDaniels, 2 players who had, absolutely elite level defensive showings this season. And you look at Karl-Anthony Towns, by way of the Suns dictating with Kevin Durant, that put Karl-Anthony Towns on players like Eric Gordon in the very first matchup of the season. And then in this most recent matchup, they put him on Grayson Allen. And that's naturally an opportunity for the Suns to dictate. You can get quick hit-aheads and just generally with their flow and movement on offense, attacking Karl-Anthony Towns, forcing him to guard multiple actions in the half court, something that's naturally going to be a stress for him, especially coming off of his recent injury history. With I believe it was his knee that kept him out for a month and some change over that latter end of the regular season stretch. So even before getting specifically to Kevin Durant, I think just his presence and the fact that he's able to manipulate matchups naturally by being healthy and being on the floor for the Suns and in their favor, kind of gives them an opportunity to put the Timberwolves in rotation because they're going to be on absolutely high alert whenever Durant does have the ball.
Yeah, look, it's like it's the modern NBA, so you can't always just look at who's guarding who. You know, there's so much switching, there's so much transition play, there is all sorts of complicated game planning. I think we're going to see all that in this series, but I guess to me, if it's Towns, which I think from Minnesota's standpoint is probably the safest place to put Cat, even though it's maybe the best scorer on the Suns, it's the most like-sized player, the most maybe comfortable situations for Cat to have to defend in, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. So whatever it is, I think there's ways for Durant to exploit that, right? If it's Towns, it's like, all right, you know, does Durant go into a little bit more off-screen stuff, kind of play like Grayson Allen plays and make Cat have to navigate screens, or, you know, just be on the jump to attack a closeout, knowing that Cat's maybe going to struggle to kind of keep a stance and backpedal and defend in space? Is it just straight ISOing and, you know, make him foul you or make him just really kind of give effort and energy? But on the other end, too, if it is Cat that Durant defends, that's not exactly easy. I mean, Cat can be an inconsistent player. His approach isn't always what you love to see. He can, you know, charges and all, but he scored what, 50 in the All-Star game? Like, he is a handful. So I think some of those positional differences, the size mismatches that these two teams have, they kind of come together in the form of Durant, in the form of Towns, and I think who wins that or who can kind of maybe play up to or beyond the regular season level that each team did through that position is going to really dictate what happens here. But the other part of this, Stephen, that is interesting to me is we kind of closed on it the last time you were on, and it felt like it was worth exploring a little bit more. KD had, you know, a lot of offensive responsibility the first portion of the season, 33% usage rate in the month of November. His role in usage kind of fluctuated after that. He had stretches where he was really, really good defensively. January, February time, he had, you know, his career high scoring actually came in a loss in March to the Celtics. He just fit in where he needed to. But he did play a ton of minutes, 37 per game or something like that, 37.2 per game. And I just think, like, is he fresh and is there another level he can reach is a question. I'm not doubting it. I'm not questioning it. But I think everybody has that question this time of year. And given how much he had to do in the regular season, it'll be interesting to see what that looks like for him.
Yeah, I think that's certainly something to keep in mind. And I think that's also, for me, why it was so relevant for the Suns to execute in the manner in which they did in that latter stretch of the regular season, to afford him as well as the team an opportunity at some semblance of rest while other teams are fighting for their lives in this play-in scenario, you're granting yourself opportunity to stay home, get some semblance, like I said, of rest, and naturally prime yourself for the beginning of a series that's going to certainly be arduous on all of the demands that you have upon your top-end talents on the offensive side of the ball. I think that's obviously naturally they should be a top 6 seed because of the level of talent and the way that this roster was compiled. But I think process-wise, looking at fatigue and looking at management of that fatigue, this little stretch where Kevin Durant hasn't had to play games might potentially be something we look back at as something that springboards him. Because I think he's, like you mentioned, he's certainly been in need of that. And they've been heavily relying upon him, obviously, just to get to this 6 seed spot, to do some things that might be a little bit more lenient towards playoff level Durant at this point in his career, rather than something that's just kind of run of the mill over the course of the regular season for him, particularly on the defensive side of the floor, but generally speaking as well. I do agree there.
Yeah, but you know, at the same time, right, it's like, first, I was just going to agree with you. LeBron played 41 minutes in that play-in game, right? Like, that is an example of what can happen for some of these veteran players when you put yourself in that situation. But It's just, I guess part of why I bring it up again is not to doubt it. And I'll eat crow for the fact that I was expecting to build in a little bit of an absence for Durant at this age and based on his recent history. And a bunch of people thought I was like wishing that on him. Of course I wasn't, but I also got it wrong. I can admit that. At the same time, I do think despite the heavy load he had to carry and the minutes and everything else, there is something to be said for he's also now not working himself back into shape or getting comfortable or getting kind of reps and conditioning and all that stuff. Last year, he was coming off of an injury. The 2022 playoffs, he had an injury and came back in early March. Was great down the stretch of that season, but, still had to kind of adjust there. So obviously got swept that season. So not having to be coming off of that is also nice. But let's get to some more reasons why for how the Suns can win, keys for how the Suns can win as we continue on here. First, today's show brought to you by Yahoo Finance. Let's get straight to the point. You want to grow your portfolio to deal with the rising costs of inflation, pay off your debt or your mortgage, pretty much anything standing in the way of you and financial freedom, of course. And with Yahoo Finance, you can get access to the news, data, and tools that you need in order to help reach that financial freedom. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or looking for extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need in one place. They are the #1 finance destination, producing a holistic look at the financial news cycle with breaking news, perspective, analyst ratings, independent research, charts, customizable charts, I should say, and so much more. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments, a comprehensive perspective of what sets apart great investors, and Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. Join over 90 million users with Yahoo Finance. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com. The #1 financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. Today's show also brought to you by the FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place any bet. That's $150 straight into your account, win or lose. We have the play-in games on Friday night, but of course, game 1 of Suns-Wolves on Saturday at 12:30. Wolves -2. A little bit of action in their direction, I believe. I think it was -1 to open. I've been telling you the over-under line, though, 214. 2 of the 3 regular season games went over that number. That could be interesting. Tons of stuff going on at the FanDuel Sportsbook. Check it out. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Stephen, I'm passing it to you. What is your first key that comes to mind of what has to happen for the Suns to beat Minnesota?
I think being detailed and really process oriented with their approach on the offensive side of the ball is maybe the chief most important thing for this team. And I think naturally it aligns directly with the way that this roster was built. Obviously, with the offensive approach in mind, everything kind of stemming from how well they're able to execute within whatever their game plan is against whatever opponent. The thing that should consistently stick is that this team should never have any issues with producing offensively. And I think the best maybe example of that is how they performed against this Minnesota Timberwolves team. Both of the first game that they went against this team and this most recent game in which they went against the Minnesota Timberwolves, we saw the Suns hand the Timberwolves their worst showings on the season in terms of looking at production and ratings, and particularly for the Timberwolves defensively. And just kind of looking at it from that perspective, the Suns across the entire other 29 teams that went against the Minnesota Timberwolves this season, the Suns had a 129.3 offensive rating. League average against the Timberwolves this season was 108.9. So they were an astronomical level of effectiveness and efficiency better than most teams going up against this juggernaut defensively that is the Timberwolves. And if you look exclusively to the half court, league average against the Timberwolves was 92.4. The Suns finished first in that respect as well at 113.2. And Again, those numbers are gaudy. They're very much telling. And I think it speaks firstly to the level of shot making that the Phoenix Suns are able to compile over multiple pockets of a game and just generally sustain at a certain level that most teams cannot. This is not for lack of defensive execution from the Timberwolves. It just really speaks to how much the Suns can dictate and put pressure on the defense and keep a defense consistently in rotation when they're playing with the blend of movement and screening off ball and screening on ball. And they're not archaic and robotic in the process in which they go about executing their offensive game plan. And I think when they mix it all together, and this, again, it's not robotic or archaic, they can keep teams in rotation, especially a team that's stingy defensively like the Timberwolves, to the extent that they're not necessarily used to. Now they're making a lot more rotations. They're having to communicate more, and this puts a different type of stress on them. So that's kind of where I start with that. How about you? What do you think about that one?
I like it. I have a very similar one, so I think we can just kind of lump them together, to be honest. Mine was kind of not the opposite, but transition.
Yeah.
Because they had, even in the second game where it was a little bit more of a defensive battle, neither team breaks 197-87 on the 5th of April, I believe it was. Including that game, the Suns scored at least 1.3 points per possession in transition in each win over Minnesota this season. In that one, it was 1.3, which is still pretty good. In the other ones, it was like 1.7. On top of that, you had the Wolves averaging, I've said this metric like every day of this week already, but it's still important. The Wolves averaged about 16, I think, turnovers per game against the Suns, which was really, really high for their season average. I'm not sure that holds, but if it does, you got to pounce on those. And if Minnesota does find some ways to not solve the Suns' defense, but just whether it's personnel, scheme, effort, whatever, that half-court number gets a little worse, which I think you would have to expect it to do so, given the numbers you just said. I doubt you're going to be performing 15, 20 points better than other teams for 7 straight games. Otherwise, Minnesota fans are going to be, tearing their hair out by the end of it. You got to score in the easy ways. You got to get those transition points. So kind of you lump all that in. Can they create as many transition opportunities? Can they convert them as well? And obviously that only becomes more important if the half-court stuff does get a little more, a little quieted down, we'll say. So, and then honestly, I had it in both directions, right? Because we can talk about Anthony Edwards a bunch from Minnesota's side. I think he's going to be looking for that too. And we know the Suns' transition defense can be leaky. So I think whoever wins that segment, because both teams are a little inconsistent with it on both ends, frankly, that's going to go a long way. If the Suns are, and it fits right into what you're saying. Like if the Suns are in a flow and they're doing their thing, we know that's when they're at their best. And I think it'll mean a lot of, it might even mean frankly that the series ends even more quickly if that's going for them as well.
Yeah, I think that's an astute point that you made. And it's funny, we are in such sync. We're in lockstep right now because I was also going to mention under this offensive process umbrella, a nice caveat within that is how effective and how sustained and chaos-inducing activity can their defense be. The Suns had the second best defensive rating against this Minnesota Timberwolves team this season. League average against them was 116.1. So they saw some solid success in a sustained manner against the majority of the team. But if you look at it specifically against the Suns, that 102.7 drops a whole lot. And I think a lot of it is their abilities to just kind of send the Minnesota Timberwolves off script. I think a lot of the ways that they defend Anthony Edwards aligns with how their game plan was against another player that's extremely downhill oriented in Zion Williamson. And it's the ability to switch across multiple actions in an emergency fashion, but also if they just want to generally flatten out actions, they can press that button whenever they want to and rely upon whoever it is that's at the point of attack once Anthony Edwards is included in the primary action to hold down the fort for at least 1 or 2 dribbles and containing the ball. And from there, having Jusuf Nurkic being able to help off of Rudy Gobert for multiple beats within the defensive coverage to flatten out a drive or potentially Anthony Edwards trying to turn the corner to get downhill, in addition to the rest of the Suns being on high alert to load up in the gaps, get to the blocks and elbows in a college basketball defensive style of sense, to take away the presentation of how everything looks from Anthony Edwards. And if he is able to eventually and naturally squeak by the initial point of attack defense, have those gaps loaded up to where somebody can peel switch or just generally switch and hold it down for that person that's on ball. And again, keep them flattened out. And the big thing with me for the Suns against the Minnesota Timberwolves, their rotations have been so sharp, but even before getting 2 rotations, they've done such a solid job of keeping themselves out of the scenarios that demand for you to make rotations just by containing the ball. Again, whoever it is that they might be guarding, whether that be Mike Conley in an empty corner pick and roll with Rudy Gobert, and the multitude of actions they get into with that 2-man approach in the empty corner, the low man being peeled in early, as well as the elbow help person peeling in from the nail being in early. Again, just the presentation, showing activity and getting steals and playing with activity from there with deflections is important to their offensive process.
I can already see the comments rolling in, Stephen. I get this sometimes when I'm talking, but especially when you've started joining us weekly, there's going to be somebody going, can we please get clips on the show for what you guys are talking about? If you would like to pay millions to the NBA to get some clips on here, guys, I'd love you to do that. Unfortunately, I don't have, JJ Redick, LeBron James money or anything like that, so they're not going to be here. You just got to imagine it in your head, and we'll do the best to explain ourselves as we go. But I'm very glad you brought up Jusuf Nurkic. He's actually the player that I had last on my list here of areas that the Suns need to consistently dominate to win. He's not an area. That makes it sound like kind of a fat joke. It's not. I promise. He is just he is going to be important here. So let's talk about him next. I know you'll be pleased to do that. He is your guy, Stephen. But let's first. Today's show brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. It isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. They're only on LinkedIn. This describes me perfectly. I've told you before, I got my current day job writing about sports media at Awful Announcing through LinkedIn. I wasn't exactly looking. I wasn't on the prowl. I didn't have some kind of temp agency or something contacting me, but I was poking around. I used LinkedIn here and there. I saw it. I knew I wanted to work there. I knew that would be a goal. Applied, knew the qualifications, knew I was qualified, reached out to the person listed as the hiring manager. We got it locked down from there. LinkedIn knows small businesses are wearing a ton of hats, might not have the time or resources, so join the 2.5 million small businesses using LinkedIn to make the process easier. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, let's close it out, Steven. So I'll jump to Jusuf Nurkic here. You listed some of the ways that he's been utilized defensively as a line of defense against Anthony Edwards downhill. And I've talked about that quite a bit leading up to this game one. Can he nail that timing? Is there dare, right, of Ant to not consistently find the drop pass on the short roll, the lob pass at the basket, and involve Gobert that much, or just betting on that the Wolves don't want to do that too much because Gobert's never been a really, really high usage offensive player. That's kind of what the Suns are counting on with Nurkic playing that coverage. If they solve it, can he execute something different? Rim protection against a drive-heavy team in general is going to be big, whether that's Towns or Conley on the floaters or Ant, who I just mentioned. That's kind of on, and don't foul, right? Like across all those things. Don't foul Gobert like we saw in the third regular season game. Don't get handsy with Ant. Don't, stand in front of a cat barreling to the basket and end up with foul trouble. And frankly, the other reason I bring this up, Stephen, is I don't think either of the Suns' backup center options in terms of Drew Eubanks or Thad Young are great matchups in this series. If we get a healthy and aggressive and consistent Karl Anthony Towns kind of playing that backup center spot, which is what he does when they're healthy, I don't love those other minutes. So you really have to win the 30 to 34, 36, whatever it is that Nurkic is going to be out there in order to feel good about your chances to win every game. Because you might end up a minus when Eubanks or Thad Young are out there.
Yep, I think the big fella is going to be extremely important in the process for the Suns. For the reasons that you mentioned defensively, he has to be sharp. He also has to be sharp with his activity. And I think maybe the most important thing for Nurkic defensively in this series, and we saw it a lot in the third game, the most recent game against the Timberwolves, but he has to do so without fouling, like you mentioned. And that's his ability to impact the basketball. Playing in multiple coverage, sometimes in drop, sometimes at the level of the screen, just up to touch, and then reverting back to drop, but also being at the level of the screen and being able to flat hedge to keep Anthony Edwards, like we talked about, from turning the corner, to keep Mike Conley in the empty corner pick and rolls with Rudy Gobert from turning the corner. Also to buy time for that guard that's navigating the screen to get back over as well in succession with the rest of the rotations defensively to continue to help the helper in that sense. I think those things are important, but also on the offensive side of the ball, with Rudy Gobert obviously naturally being most at home when he's able to be in drop coverage, hovering around the free throw line or below that, staying on the proverbial porch defensively and not having to come out. When you got the likes of Bradley Beal, Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and even Grayson Allen, and even Eric Gordon in this series, using them as moving targets on offense, where you're getting a lot of that moving target sense from those high-end offensive pieces, is when Jusuf Nurkic has the ball above the break or just generally outside of the three-point line. Rudy Gobert is going to be reluctant to get out of that drop coverage. And if he is trying to get out of that coverage late to try to meet one of those ball handlers at the level of the screen or at the level of a handoff, that's naturally bringing the biggest Waldo, I call it Waldo, some people call it pigeons, in matchup hunting, bringing the piece that you want to attack most from his desired position on the floor. And naturally in that, we've seen Devin Booker find a multitude of pull-up pockets within the flow of the Suns offense. Again, not just being stagnant, pick and roll after pick and roll after pick and roll, maybe getting to that portion of the offense, but naturally getting there off of movement before anything else, I think is extremely important. So Booker being able to find those pull-up three-point opportunities against Rudy Gobert and drop coverage, as well as just generally being able to navigate the mid-range, as well as a player like Grayson Allen, not necessarily always on ball, but getting off of dribble handoffs and things of that nature when an initial action is broken down. Grayson Allen had himself a field day in this matchup with the Minnesota Timberwolves this season. In those 3 games, Grayson Allen shot 62.5% on 5.3 three-point attempts a game. 62.5% on 5.3 attempts. And the Suns won his minutes. They were plus 19.7. So again, talking about things naturally in the playoffs is going to change. You're not going to be as dominant in those minutes as you were in the regular season. But even if they sustain half or a little bit less than half of that, if you're winning the Grayson Allen minutes to that extent, that's going to be something that drives you. It's something that's going to be unaccounted for from the Minnesota Timberwolves, and obviously using defensive capital to stop Devin Booker, Bradley Beal, and Kevin Durant. If he's knocking down 62.5% of his three-point attempts stemming from the opportunities generated by those three, that's a trump card in any series for the Suns. And if they get that and he sustains that, they could see themselves in the conference finals, honestly.
Yeah, I loved all of that. I mean, I think, right, Minnesota, the way that they're going to guard, any team that's going to guard where kind of the structure comes first as the strength, right? Like their infrastructure, Gobert at the basket, the length that they have, the help, the scheme that they've developed, the chemistry they have, that's naturally going to have things that are going to come open. I mean, like Jason Kidd's the only guy, right, who like in recent NBA history has tried to concoct a scheme that takes away everything and it ended up sucking. Like that doesn't really work. But I think especially when you have the personnel that is so specific, that's kind of where it starts to creep in with the Gobert limitations and all that, the conversation. Obviously, Gobert's not guarding Allen, but it's kind of the ripples of the way they want to defend. You're going to get stuff sprung open for Allen. I think Nurkic being able to be a difference maker, creating some of those, creating space with screens, finding pockets, being a playmaker. It's just all those little ways that the Suns can kind of pick at what Minnesota does, and I think he'll be a big part. The only other reason I wanted to bring Nurk up, though, is, again, sometimes fans take this as me doubting or being negative. It's just to acknowledge it's a fact. He is The one deep run Portland made during Dame's time there, Nurk missed. He's only played 16 playoff games in his career. One of them was in 2016-17, and then he had one series apiece in 18 playoffs, the bubble playoffs, and the 21 playoffs. So it's not like his performance has fallen off or there's any big concern there. It's just for a guy who's been in the league as long as he has, there's a surprisingly small amount of playoff experience. So it'll just be a new test for him, and some of those missed layups or turnovers or mental mistakes on defense, that has to cut down. And no one player is the only culprit of those things for the Suns this season, but obviously Nurk had his share of mistakes, so you want to see him kind of lock in the same way everybody else needs to. But we'll probably have time for one more key here before we wrap. Steven, what do you got?
Yeah, for me, it's two numbers, 48.8 and 29.3. 48.8 being the percentage that the Suns shot on 28 attempts from deep, almost 29 attempts from deep against the Minnesota Timberwolves this season. And then the 29.3 or the 28.8 was a high number in terms of obviously attempts for the Suns, but they were the second best team in terms of 3-point percentage against the Minnesota Timberwolves. And that number is something that's going to dictate to, like I mentioned, the rotations and just a general level of aggression that the Minnesota Timberwolves can put forth on defense. And then the second number being 29.3, that's the number of assists that the Suns averaged against the Minnesota Timberwolves this season. Those two numbers are directly aligned with each other. When the ball is hopping, when they're moving the ball, they're moving bodies, they're screening a lot, they're getting into multiple different actions within 24 seconds. Like you mentioned, they're sprinkling in their transition attempts stemming from the defense. You're at their mercy. And that's something that, again, the Minnesota Timberwolves are not used to defending against because they're just such a dictative style of defense to where naturally their process typically outweighs the opponent's process. And when you play games on their terms, they get ugly, they get super inefficient, and naturally that plays into their hands. We saw that for the latter three quarters against the Minnesota Timberwolves in that second matchup with the Suns. They had the 44-point outburst in the first quarter, and they just sustained the rest of the way, but the rest of that game was certainly played on the Timberwolves' terms. So the Suns being able to sustain their process on offense and just finding those scoring pockets across multiple runs over the course of 48 minutes is extremely important. And I think we've seen them hit that template multiple times against this team in two different renditions of themselves, no less. That early season matchup and then the latter two. The template's there. It's just about how well they're able to execute within their two-way process.
All right, part 2 coming up. It'll be in your feed at the same time as this one. How the Suns could lose the series. But it won't be a downer. It'll be how do they not? How do they avoid those mistakes? But what could befall them if they don't stick to the template that we've laid out here? So hit follow or subscribe if you have not already. Dig in, get that episode, get a recap tomorrow. We'll be back throughout the series. Don't forget to read Stephen at Bright Side of the Sun. Listen to him at PHNX, and we'll catch you in part 2.